Hey, Katie.
Hey, Ben.
So last week we talked a bit about election polling as it pertains to the US election, but I remember you mentioning that you had some interesting things to say as it pertains to something else.
Oh, well, yeah. So I was thinking about the Brexit vote that was taken, I guess, maybe a month ago or so now at this point. And that was, a kind of interesting point of contrast. It was, again, another big national election. And there's sort of the reputation that the polls failed in that one. So I think it's interesting and it's worth unpacking.
Just over the pond, you are listening to Linear Digressions.
Yeah, so just to quickly recap in case you live under a rock and somehow missed it. So Brexit was a referendum that was run in the UK about a month ago, and the question was whether the UK was going to remain part of the European Union or decide to leave. And there was, this big national referendum that was taken, and until even the day of the vote, most of the predictions were saying that they thought it was going to be close, but that they thought that the Remain faction was going to win out, and that the UK would decide to stay in the EU, and that is not what happened.
Yes, that's not what
Leave
happened.
actually won, yeah, and so these people are like, "What happened?" Like,
Also, how much did Leave win by? Was it
so
significant or was it really, really close?
I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by significant or really, really close. I think it was something like 48 to 52. So I would say that's fairly close, but not so
Yeah,
close that it was like, 2000 election, Palm Beach County,
right.
Florida, sort of close.
Right.
We're still talking about like,
Also, I
I
think
don't know,
it's
hundreds of
funny
thousands
to
of votes.
Also, I think it's funny to talk about it as was it significant? Well, yes, it was significant because, one side won and one side lost.
Well, yeah, and there's
So,
also the issue of like statistical significance, which
right.
can be like easy to confuse whether if somebody says significant, it depends on if they're talking about a statistical result or they're just kind of using it heuristically as like this
Yeah.
is important or whatever.
So I should watch my language.
Yeah, well, so it's kind of interesting. So there are a few things that I think are interesting to unpack about the Brexit poll. And the first one has to do with statistical significance.
Oh,
So
okay.
they have these projections of, we were talking a little bit about polls in the last episode and how it might say something like, we'll take the case of Brexit. They said 51% chance, expectation that we have for what's the vote share that Remain is going to get. So we think Remain is going to win, but the margin of error on that is, let's say, 3 percentage points. So, so what does that actually mean? Um, and usually what they mean by those kinds of numbers is it'll be something, so that 3 percentage points will be something like a 90% confidence interval. And nominally, what that usually means, and it depends a little bit on exactly what kind of statistical methods they're using to derive it, but it means something like 90% of the time, if we were to run this election 100 times, 90% of the time it would be between, I guess, 54 and 48. So 51 plus minus 3. And sometimes the exact details of that will be a little bit different, but you get the idea. But what it's also saying is that then 10% of the time we would think that the election could be more, extreme than that. Like we could be wrong by more than that. And so that 3% just kind of gives you an idea of the uncertainty that's attached to the projection that they're making. So first thing is that there's some really good, and the number that I just quoted, it was something like 52 plus minus 3%, or plus minus 4%, depending on the kinds of polling sources you were looking at. There's some pretty good analyses about why, instead of thinking about that 3 or 4 percentage point error bar, instead of thinking of that as like a 90% confidence interval, it's probably more accurate to think of it as like a 50% confidence interval, and that, in fact, there was much more uncertainty about the projections they were making than that number would imply, which means that in the case where you have something like 51 plus minus, 6 or 7, then it means it's wide open, and like either it's basically a coin flip at that point which side is going to win. So we shouldn't be that surprised that Leave won if it's a coin flip, right? There's a very healthy chance that could have happened. So that's the first thing, is when we're talking about the significance of some of these projections, to think about that very carefully, because it can mean all kinds of things. The second thing about the Brexit polling is that a lot of these models kind of have a couple components to them. They have, what are we seeing in the polls right now? Like if we were to call 1,000 people today or 10,000 people today, what are the numbers that we would get? Versus what have we been seeing for the past weeks and months? And so you can have these longer term trends that happen in weeks and months, but by and large, things usually don't move that quickly. And so having that historical context tends to kind of smooth things out. And when you start to see things that look very different from anything you've seen in the past, very often, that kind of past historical context kicks in a little bit, and it says effectively like, okay, we're seeing something different in the polls today relative than what we saw last week. And a perfectly plausible explanation for that is that we're just getting some sampling error right now. We're getting some statistical noise. And so let's not get excited here. Chances are that this is just a fluctuation, a sampling thing, and it's not actually indicating big changes in public opinion.
So I have kind of a larger picture question, which is, as a consumer of the end result of all of these statistical analyses, if they have such large error bars, like how should I look at these then? I mean, should I, if the error bars are relatively wide, should I look at it as a coin flip? Or, I mean, definitely the way that it's reported on is not, oh, it's a coin flip,
Yeah, so it really depends on what your source is exactly, because some sources will do a lot of this work for you. So one of the things that 538 does and the New York Times does, I think actually probably a lot of different poll aggregators do at this point, is they'll crunch it all and they'll turn it into a number, something like 75% of the time we think, given the numbers we're seeing right now, like 75% chance our model is giving us that, it's going to go for Remain in the when the votes are actually counted.
Right, for Brexit.
And so then that's a fairly simple thing to interpret, obviously. Like everybody sort of understands what 75% means, or at least hypothetically they could. Yeah. It can sometimes be a little bit hard to understand like small probability events. We're not very good at intuitively understanding them, but anyway.
It's like 75 plus or minus even 5%. Like I can turn that into the word probably.
Yeah, so that's saying that if we were to run the Brexit election 100 times, we would expect that 75 of them you would see Leave winning or Remain winning. It doesn't even really matter. For the sake of argument. And then of course, like if you were to actually run the election 100 times because you had some kind of like magical thing, then you might see exactly 75 break one way and 25% the other way, but you could start to get sampling that sampling effects in that, and you might actually see something that's like 73-27 and or 78-22, and those would be perfectly sensible things to see as well. So you're right that there's usually kind of an implicit error bar on those meta predictions, but usually the implicit error bar is not reported directly. Usually the way that it gets incorporated is just if there's really big error bars, if they have really big uncertainty on what's going to happen, especially with something like the American presidential election. Like we've done a lot of presidential elections. We know that like usually all other things being equal, a decent guess is 50-50. And so if you have a lot of uncertainty that's coming to you from your polls, it's going to, usually what these models do is they have something that's called like reversion to the mean, and they tend to just drift back toward 50%, which is basically saying like, we don't exactly know what's going on. And like, your guess is as good as mine, 50%. I don't know. And then the other thing that is worth keeping in mind about the Brexit vote and some of the other betting sites that you see sometimes. This is another thing that I was reading up on after the Brexit vote. One of the reasons that people were so surprised by the Brexit vote is they actually have very healthy betting markets. I don't know that healthy is totally a fair word to use.
Yeah.
But, robust active betting markets where you can actually go on and bet real money about what the outcome is going to be. And so since those are markets, they're supposedly subject to market effects that help them hypothetically be more accurate than polls, maybe, if depending on how you think about it. And, thinking exactly about how markets are supposed to have, good information in them is sort of a topic all in and of itself. But let me put it this way, that hypothetically, there are reasons why you could think that a betting market might have odds that are closer to the true odds than various polls or models or whatever. And the thing about the betting markets was the betting markets were saying, 90% chance that we're going to remain in the EU. And that was part of the reason also that people were so surprised was those betting markets were way wrong. And so there's been, a decent amount of analysis ex post to try to understand what might have been going on. And it's, I'm not enough of an expert to exactly say, I feel like I understand the underlying mechanics of how some of these things are hypothetically supposed to work, but I also don't understand the details of what kind of psychology of people drives people to participate in these kinds of British betting markets. And I imagine that a lot of times they might not be betting completely in terms of what they think the actual odds are, but it's kind of speculative, or it's hedging, or people are doing it for fun, or there's all kinds of weird things that could be going on in betting markets. And so I won't speculate too much as to exactly the exact dynamics that drive those markets. But the point that I was reading about, and that I think is worth keeping in mind, is that, like I said, a lot of times these markets will tend to err on the side of thinking that that things are 50-50, or that things are going to stay roughly the same as they've always been in the past. They tend to be a little bit conservative. Not conservative in the sense of Democratic, Republican, conservative or liberal. I mean it in the sense of conservative, that they tend to favor slightly things just kind of continuing on as they have in the past, versus things really getting rocked in a big way, in the way that a leave vote was a really big thing.
I see.
And so then they become these kind of self-perpetuating systems where everybody just kind of thinks that there's this conventional wisdom, of course we're never going to leave the EU. And that gets incorporated into the kinds of that becomes potentially even just an assumption in the model that we think that Britain really doesn't want to leave. And so we would have to see something very, very strong that's coming to us out of the polls to convince us that that assumption is wrong. But I don't know, maybe that assumption is not as strong as we think it is, or not as strong as we've put it into our model to be. And so if we see a poll that says 53% for leave, we might say oh, whatever, that's just a fluctuation. I know this because we've always voted this way in the past, and we're just going to keep doing that. And then when 53% actually shows up on election day, then you were just wrong. And so this was kind of one of the other things that I think happened with the Brexit vote, and that people should be aware of when they're trying to understand how to interpret some of these forecasts. Is they might say something like, well, there's a 25% chance of the outcome happening this way, and people are kind of oh yeah, but we've never had anything like that crazy happen, so I don't think it's really gonna happen.
So human psychology heavily weighting that there's no precedent for this, and so therefore it's unlikely.
Yeah, and so I think that was another thing that kind of bit people, especially on the Brexit election, because that was just such a strange
that's a big
vote
one.
To have been taken.
It's not we've never elected someone this crazy, or we've never it's not something like that. It's this is a country leaving a consortium that's kind of big, and it's not something that happens that could conceivably happen every 4 years necessarily either. Linear Digressions is a Creative Commons endeavor, which means you can share or use it any way you like. Just tell them we said hi. To find out more about this or any other episode of Linear Digressions, go to lineardigressions.com. And if you like this podcast, go ahead and leave us a review on iTunes so other people get to listen to this content too. You can always get in touch with either of us.
Our emails are ben@lineardigressions.com and katie@lineardigressions.com, in case you have comments or suggestions for future shows. You can tweet us at lindigressions. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.